Okay, we will call the planning meeting of August 11th, 2020 to order. Roll call, please.
Anna here.
Sullivan here.
Grillo here.
Kavich here.
Guzikowski here.
Aldani here.
Seifert here.
Chandler here.
Thank you all. Before we go on to the minutes, I'm going to ask Carrie to read in the notice of video phone conferencing that we will be participating in tonight. If you would, Carrie.
The City of Oak Creek is authorized to hold this public meeting remotely during the COVID-19 public health emergency under the March 16th and March 20th advisories from the Office of Open Government and the Wisconsin Department of Justice. Per the advisories, this meeting being conducted via Zoom video conference with telephone conferencing capabilities was duly noticed per the City of Oak Creek Municipal Code and statutory notice requirements more than 24 hours in advance of the meeting. Members of the public have been advised of the options for participation via direct mailing to property owners within 300 feet of a proposal, via the COVID-19 information page on the city's website, via social media, and via the information contained on the meeting agenda. This meeting may also be viewed at the city's YouTube page, the link for which was contained in all aforementioned notice methods. The meeting recording will also be accessible on the city's YouTube page within 48 hours. Plan commissioners and participants are initially muted upon joining the meeting. Plan commissioners and staff have the ability to mute and unmute their microphones throughout the meeting. Please mute at all times except for roll call, motions, voting, and when recognized by the chair. Roll call and voting will occur per the usual and customary procedures, starting from Plan Commissioner seating positions south to north in the Common Council chambers. The chair will facilitate questions and comments by calling on each Plan Commissioner or by requesting the use of the raise hand function in the Zoom webinar control panel. Only speak once you have been recognized by the chair or moderator. Applicants, the representatives, and all other participants who wish to speak will be unmuted when there is a direct request for information from the Plan Commissioner staff. When the participant uses the raise hand function within the Zoom webinar control panel and the moderator verbally indicates that they are unmuted, or when a phone participant dials *9 to indicate that they wish to speak, and the moderator verbally indicates that their line is open. When unmuted, all participants must state their name and address for the record, then proceed with comments or questions. Questions and comments may also be entered into the Q&A function within the Zoom webinar control panel. Staff and/or the moderator will monitor this function during the meeting and provide the information requested. There shall be no private messages or side conversations during the meeting utilizing the chat or Q&A functions. Chat and Q&A messages are part of the public record. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Carrie. If everybody would please, commissioners, take a look at the minutes of July 28th, 2020. And if you don't find any omission, errors, or corrections, or questions, comments, we'll move for a motion.
Seifert moves to approve the minutes of July 28th, 2020.
Guzikowski will second.
Roll call, please.
Hannah, aye.
Sullivan, aye.
Grillo, aye.
Kavich, aye.
Guzikowski, aye.
Aldani, aye.
Seifert, aye.
Chandler, aye.
Okay. Gets us to item 4, Carrie, significant common council actions.
There were none.
That is efficient. Item 5A, new business, is a release of easement document for the Brandywood Apartments at 8900 South 20th, Wood Creek Drive, and Riverwood Arms Estate at 500 West Riverwood Drive. Carrie?
I apologize that this map is actually incorrect on the screen, but this is for the release of easements in an original agreement from 1991 between the Brandywood Estate, Brandywood Apartments rather, Brandywood Estates LLC owning, and the Riverwood Arms Estates noted as Legacy Riverwood LLC. Back in 1991, they had a site plan review that showed tennis courts on the Brandywood property that could be shared with the tenants of the Riverwood Arms Estates buildings that are just to the south of it. And they have both requested that the shared easement for that access be terminated. The language in the 1991 easement, however, required that any change or release or anything having to do with that easement also required the city's review and approval first. We were signatory to the original agreement, which was recorded. So the tennis courts are disused, they're a little bit in disrepair, and it would be better served for the Brandywood property if that was actually converted in the future to parking. So again, both parties are asking for this to be released. And if the Plan Commission is okay with that, or if there aren't any questions, there is a suggested motion for approval on the screen. I will note that it requires both Plan Commission and Common Council approval. So this is both an approval and a recommendation. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Carrie. As Carrie stated, we don't have the applicant with us tonight, but I will open it up to the commissioners for questions or comments. Starting from what would be my left, Steen, anything?
No, I don't have anything. It looks good and straight to the point. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt?
Nothing from engineering.
Dawn?
Nothing for me.
Chris?
Well, I would just say that this is in my district, and I think that when you look at that area for parking and the need of potential parking, I can understand where they possibly would go with it. It is kind of disappointing in the day and age of health and fitness that the tennis courts aren't used, because I know that throughout the city, our tennis courts seem to be used at all of our other parks throughout the whole city. So it just is kind of disappointing to see it go on a downhill slide that and they're in disrepair. But I understand, and I would agree with the motion if we make it.
Thank you. Don?
No, I have no questions.
Fred?
No questions.
Chauncey?
Yes, I do have a question. I have a question for Carrie in the absence of the applicant. So based on what I saw, this release is specific to, is it creating more parking, or is there no parking on the property?
No, all the release has to do with is access and use of the existing tennis courts. It has nothing to do with their future use as parking.
Okay, so they're just releasing use for the tennis courts, that's it?
That's correct.
Okay, and then if it changes to anything else such as parking, does that come back to us?
It does, because it's a plan modification.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have no further comments. It's voluntarily asked for by both parties. I think it's certainly within our means to make this motion. So with that, I'll call for a motion.
Christine moved that the Plan Commission approves and recommends Common Council approval of the agreement for release of easements and consent to release of easements submitted by Bernard Kearney, Corliss, and Brady on behalf of Brandwood Estates LLC and Legacy Riverwood LLC for the properties at 8900 20th South Wood Creek Drive and 500 West Riverwood Drive.
Seifert seconds.
Roll call.
Hannah, aye.
Sullivan, aye.
Rillo, aye.
Davich, aye.
Guzikowski, aye.
Oldani, aye.
Seifert, aye.
Chandler, aye.
Thank you. Moving on to item 5B. I mentioned earlier, a few meetings back, about our zoning code update discussion. One of the most important things this commission is going to have to do all year is really take a look at this zoning code update. This is our update discussion. So I will turn it over at this time to Carrie, and they will take it from there.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So we have the first couple of articles to review here, Articles 2 through 4. Article 2, not wanting to spend too much time on, it's the establishment of districts. There are a couple of changes. The B1 district was looked at by our consultants from Halcyon Levine. Jackie is here with me to discuss these zoning code updates. B1 was eliminated in favor of looking at the other B districts that are throughout the city, we didn't have too many properties that were zoned B1 anyway, and they were presented to go into another B district that was more suitable based on the existing use, the setbacks, the existing dimensions of the property, the existing acreage of the property. So really it only affected a small handful of parcels at the most. The overlay districts, they're just changing a little bit in terms of nomenclature. We are going to have the some of the overlay districts from the 27th Street looked at, and we also have another overlay district that we are going to have more information on in terms of how it's applied, and that's for PUDs. If there are any questions about the establishment of districts, we can certainly talk about that, but kind of the heart of the discussion for tonight would be in Articles 3 and 4. And I'm going to ask Jackie to share her screen now. She has a couple of areas that we want to focus on.
Would you please allow me to do that? There we go. Thank you. All right. So thank you all so much for having me back. I think the last time I was in front of this group was for the public hearing for the comprehensive plan. So we're excited to be starting the zoning code update in response to the adoption and all of the changes in policy and recommendations that were a part of the comprehensive plan. So very similar to the comprehensive plan project, our zoning code update has 6 steps. So the first one, the kickoff, that happened along with the zoning workshop in October 2019. Then the plan was adopted in March 2020. So after that, we dug deep into the diagnostic report. So that was a deep dive and analysis of your existing zoning code, comparing it to the recommendations of the comprehensive plan, as well as best practices. So we went back and forth with staff quite a bit on really refining that document and making those recommendations for updates to the zoning code as Oak Creek specific as possible. So once we confirmed with staff the direction that we wanted to go in for the zoning update, we moved into actually starting to revise sections of the zoning code. So the first section that we started on are the district standards. So district standards are really what I think of and what I think most people think of when they think about zoning. So they're your zoning districts, your permitted and conditional uses, so what you're allowed to do on your property, and then as well as your dimensional standards and bulk regulations. So how big can your building be? How big does your front yard need to be? That type of issue. So we are breaking down these district standards into 3 articles. Like Carrie said, Article 2 is just the establishment of districts. So it lists the city's zoning districts and establishes their purpose and intent. Article 3 is the district specific standards. So this has the permitted and conditional uses, as well as the dimensional standards, in addition to some other kind of supporting regulation, talking about required yard modifications, etc. And finally, Article 4 includes detailed regulations for specific uses. So that's cross-referenced in Article 3, but provides you with additional regulation for specific uses. So for this presentation, like Carrie said, we really wanted to focus in on Article 3 and Article 4, since there were minimal changes made to Article 2. So first I want to go over sort of a high-level overview of the recommended revisions to the articles, and then get into a couple of points of discussion that we wanted to bring before you and really get your feedback on. So first, with a high-level overview of our district-specific standards article, we have first, the bulk and dimensional standards are set forth. So currently in the code, the bulk and dimensional standards are listed for each district. Here we're proposing that they be consolidated into a single or into 2 tables, one for the residential districts and the other for the non-residential districts. So the revisions to the bulk and dimensional standards are proposed based on an appropriateness analysis that was included as a part of the diagnostic report. So this appropriateness analysis compared the lot width and lot area minimum requirements for the various single-family residential districts. They compared it to the actual development on the ground. So for example, if you have a requirement in the code for a 10,000 square foot lot, but the majority of development in that district is 8,000 square feet. It's easier for everybody if that was just lower to 8,000 square feet. You'd get fewer variance requests, etc. So those revisions to that section are really based on that appropriateness analysis. Next, we looked at refining the lot width calculation for lots that abut a cul-de-sac. We're still working with staff on really making sure that this is Oak Creek specific and exactly what the city needs, but that will definitely be a part of this update. Next, the yard setback modifications were enhanced to address new things like patios, decks, fire pits, yard art, air conditioning condensers, and more. So these are items that were left out of your existing code, and we're just adding them back in to really function how the city currently allows things. And then next, the permitted and conditional uses were consolidated to tables. So currently, like the bulk and dimensional standards, the permitted and conditional uses were listed out for each district. This can become cumbersome. The lists got very long, and then it's also repetitive. So you have uses listed for multiple districts, and if those are amended for one district, the language might be different for another, so you could run into issues of interpretation. So next, with a high-level overview of Article 4. So this article consolidates the current standards for specific uses that currently exist throughout the code. So this really makes it more user-friendly, and all of the regulations here are then referenced in those tables of permitted and conditional uses to really make it very clear when additional use standards are applicable. So we also are proposing new standards to allow more uses to be allowed as of right, and then also to establish more specific standards for conditional uses since the state's regulation for the approval of conditional use permits has changed. All right, so now I want to go into some detail on a couple of items that staff really wanted to get your thoughts on, your opinions on. So please feel free to jump in and voice your opinions, ask questions as I go through. All right, so the first area that I wanted to go over with you all was the neighborhood retail and service use. So this use is recommended to be a conditional use in the residential district based on a recommendation of the comprehensive plan to promote development in accordance with the land use plan, to support healthier living by putting residential within walking distance of commercial areas. So to accomplish this, we're recommending that the city allow for very limited commercial, retail, and service uses within residential zoning districts. So in order to really ensure that these uses would be appropriate in these residential areas, we are recommending these standards. So these would ensure that they are in keeping with the residential character of the area, and also ensure that they are not overly burdensome in terms of traffic or parking. So next this is just an example of a neighborhood serving use in my hometown of Lawrence, Kansas. So it's a small cafe that was converted from a home located at the intersection of a local road and a collector road. And it has been a great boon for the neighborhood. It's really become a public gathering space for neighbors, and hasn't caused any issues in terms of parking, over congestion, or traffic. Are there any issues or concerns or ideas you all have for the neighborhood and retail and service uses?
For those who have a printout of the articles that I emailed to you, we would be on Article 4, page 15 of 32, that talks about the districts or the neighborhood retail specific standards.
I guess I'll just shoot out first. If we had such a business like this, and I'll just use my neighborhood as an example, would parking become an issue? How is parking addressed with something like this in a residential neighborhood where our curb cuts usually only allow 1 to 2 cars parking in between driveways?
Definitely. So as you can see in this picture, there is a parking deck that was put into what was previously the backyard. But so in the standards here, let's go up one slide. There we go. We have off-street, 2 off-street parking and loading requirements based on the location of the use. So if the proposed neighborhood retail use fronted onto a existing or proposed arterial or collector roadway, so those much busier, higher capacity roadways, then the parking could be located in the front, side, or rear of the building. But then if the proposed use is located on any other type of roadway, it would need to be located on the side or rear of the primary building. So this is really encouraging that if you are located in a more residential area, you have your parking in an area that is more common for a residential area. Whereas if you have if you're located on a proposed arterial or collector roadway, you will likely have residential behind you. So wanting to locate that parking away from those residential areas in the front of the building.
Okay, thank you. As long as I have you, I guess I'll do one more question. And I know this is more use and the whole deal. When it comes to a for-profit business within the residency, when it comes to garbage pickup, snow removal, things of that nature, are they fully responsible? Will that be in our code going forward if you're a for-profit business in a residential neighborhood?
So a business would be regulated in just the same way as any other business would be, regardless of the district that they're located in. So they would have to meet all the standards that commercial uses in other districts would have to also. If you're referring to home occupations where it's a home office or that type of use that's in an actual residence, then those standards would be different.
I'm actually referring to like a CBRF that's located in a residential neighborhood.
Well, CBRF wouldn't necessarily be considered a commercial or a neighborhood retail type business. CBRFs are kind of their own animal, and it depends on what they're proposing, where they kind of fall on the statutory spectrum there. But property maintenance, snow removal, trash collection is always the responsibility of the landowner. So regardless of whether or not it's a residential or a commercial or a manufacturing district, those things are always going to be required as part of the property maintenance. It is currently required in our code.
In our CBFs, we pick up their garbage in ours with the CBFs. Correct?
Well, CBRFs, depending on how they fall, either they have residential trash pickup or they have private. So for instance, if it's considered a kind of more like an apartment complex situation, the apartment complex has private trash collection. They actually contract with Waste Management or one of the other disposal businesses. But for residential pickup, that's something that is kind of, I don't want to say on a case-by-case basis, but it almost is on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, I do think that's something we should really define, not only for our existing businesses, but future ones as well.
Dan, are you wanting them to contract out for all of those, or are you looking for just when residential pickup would occur?
I would look for them to actually be responsible for their own trash removal. If they are renting rooms with nursing or medical services attached to them, I don't know why city taxpayers is supporting that business.
Well, there's something that goes along with statutory requirements, because they're supposed to blend into a residential neighborhood so that you wouldn't be able to necessarily distinguish them from any other single-family residential home, or in the case of a duplex, any other two-family home. That's the purpose, that's the intent as mentioned by statute. And by statute, they are allowed to have up to 8 units. So it's supposed to look like a large house. And I think that's where it gets onto the whole residential pickup is, and I don't know for certain if city residents have the option of, for whatever reason, contracting for their own trash pickup. I just figured that they all go with the city. But that's something that we would offer to any other single-family residents or two-family residents in the neighborhood. So it's intended for it all to look and act and feel the same way.
I understand that. I guess my description is, yes, it'll be an oversized house, but if it's generating 6 to 8 cans, it almost calls for its own dumpster pickup.
We'll take a look at it.
Okay,
Dan-
thank you.
Dan-
That's all. Yes.
Mayor Doug Seymour chiming in here. I think there's a distinction to be made between what is referred to as a community living arrangement, which is what Carrie has spoken of, those CBRFs with, I think, 8 or fewer beds. I mean, those are permitted by right in any single family residential district. I mean, subject to certain locational requirements. That's state law. If you go above that, we have a few that are above that, that still requires a conditional use permit. And as part of that conditional use permit, it's certainly within the city's ability to dictate that they contract for their own trash removal and maintenance and things of that nature. So, you know, the ones that you're referring to might be the smaller, the community living arrangements of less than 8 beds. That's a little probably trickier, and that's a policy decision by the Common Council. But certainly, when you're getting into the realms of more than that, it's more so a business than it is just like a neighborhood CBRF. So understand your point, and we can take a look at that.
Yeah, I'd appreciate it because I still view them as a business within a residence. But okay, I've taken up enough time. Keep going. I'm sorry. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question. What about an in-house business? For example, maybe an accountant that works out of his house, but he does need some parking space because he has several clients and so forth. How do we handle that in a residential neighborhood?
There will definitely need to be clear definitions that really distinguish a home occupation from a neighborhood service use. So currently home occupations aren't permitted to have additional parking. So you can have a parking deck and you're not supposed, a home occupation is not supposed to be generating additional traffic that is undue to the residential area. So that would have to be very clearly defined. If the accountant really needs more of an office that allows him to see clients, then it may be more suitable for a neighborhood service building rather than a home occupation. So yes, that'll be dealt with in the definitions, and very clear definitions will have to distinguish the two.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Given the trend towards that we're in, where many people are now experiencing working from home and things like that, this may really become very relevant in not only the city of Oak Creek, but the entire county. So I think it's very worthwhile to take a look at this.
And Dan, I think what we're trying to do is provide a range of options for people to start out possibly working from home, maybe morph into a home occupation as we traditionally think about it, maybe even be able to grow their business and then have a way for them to transition from the home occupation possibly into this neighborhood retail service, depending on what it is, and then kind of follow them along as they progress in their business. It's something that we've been thinking about, how we can support kind of this, entrepreneurial spirit where we, help the initial startup phase all the way through to realizing possibly even having their own lease space or their own space as they grow. So this is intended to kind of maybe fill a little bit of a gap that we don't currently have, or at least we don't have a really good handle on right now in our current code.
So touching on the service end, and I'm sorry I'm dragging this out, but it's pretty interesting to me, and I do receive quite a few phone calls on things like this. If somebody were to, for example, start servicing cars and doing body work out of their garage, how does that impact us here?
So that would be
case by case. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I apologize for interrupting. An automotive type of use would be regulated very differently than a service use or a home occupation. So it's all in the definitions. We're actually, the next set of slides is about vehicle-related uses and where they are appropriate. So within the definition of a neighborhood service use, things like vehicle-related uses would definitely be excluded from that definition. So it's really all about the definition section, and I know definitions weren't included in this set of draft articles, but those are consistently and continually being revised and in flux until really the point of adoption of the zoning code, because it really is very important that they are lock solid.
Thank you. Thank you.
I actually have a question / comment. And I'm not really sure if it was asked or answered, so I apologize at the beginning. So my concern was kind of a mixing between neighborhood or residential and retail / service is the traffic with that portion. Typically that type of roadways are designed for residential different than retailers because of the impact on the volume of the traffic and the speed and so on. So was that looked at, and how is that going to be impacted, or how is this going to be monitored? Was there anything looked at this way?
Definitely. So one of the standards here for the neighborhood retail and service uses is to limit the gross floor area to 2,500 square feet. So that small size really helps to control the amount of patrons that would be visiting these locations. So a very small, boutique retailer or a small dentist's office or small cafe, those uses wouldn't generate that type of traffic that a Target would, or a some larger retailer or service use would. So by limiting the size of the use, it would also limit the traffic. We could also look at, if we really want to ensure that traffic isn't impacted, having requirements for where these are allowed to be located. So only permitted on arterial or collector roadways and not allowed on local roadways. So that's always something we could look into also, if that's a concern.
It is a concern. I would strongly recommend to be on collectors and arterials versus local roads, because of the access points also are limited, are controlled on those type of roadways versus locals. And to kind of chime in on vehicles or transmission or oil change, I'm not going to mention names because I'm not here to expose anyone. My neighbor across the street actually unofficially fixes brakes for others and changes oil and those type of things. And I'm sure he doesn't have a license or whatever. But the thing is, people have been doing it, and they are going to attract others to do that. So it's a concern for me that it's not enforced and how it's going to be followed and that type of thing. The enforcement is the key.
That's definitely a concern, the enforcement of those home occupations. It's always an issue in almost every community that we work in. The positive thing about the neighborhood retail and service use is it's a conditional. It's listed as conditional use. So the city definitely has control over what is going to be happening in that space. So if it turns out that the guy who came in asking to do a service use is actually going to be fixing cars, then the city is able to repeal that conditional use permit since he would be in violation of it.
Okay, perfect. So I was going to ask my next question. Are those by permits, or is it the city granting them that permit and can be revoked at any time if they violated that?
Yes. So all conditional use permits, if the user is in violation, could be revoked by the city.
Is there any writing in that conditional use that if any neighborhood or neighbors complained or came across with several complaints, that could be part of the revocation or revoke of the permit?
There are certain criteria that we have in place right now regarding revocation of a permit and what qualifies for that. I don't necessarily know if it's completely within the zoning code, but there are sections of code where it talks about revocation. There's a revocation section in every single portion or every single conditional use permit that we issue. It's in the conditions and restrictions that they have to sign and acknowledge. But there is a process by which the city can go forward and revoke the permit. We try and get to compliance before we get to that stage, but there is a process that we can go through. And if these are conditional use permits, it may not even get to the point where it gets approved anyway. And it would be a code violation and an enforcement situation at that point. And we do have a code enforcement update that is going to be coming through the city very soon. So it won't just be, you know, call the zoning administrator. You may have a centralized person to call in the near future.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
All right, were there any more questions or comments on neighborhood retail and service? All right, so we're going to jump ahead to vehicle related uses. So these are, like we had already started talking about, the auto body repair, car washes, fuel sales, etc. So we were really hoping to get your feedback on where these uses are appropriate within the city. So they are currently proposed to be conditional uses only within the B4 General Business District, B6 Interchange Regional Retail District, LM1 Light Manufacturing District, and M1 Manufacturing District. So do you all have any ideas or concerns about the proposed locations for these conditional use vehicle related uses?
I do have a comment. So for those type of businesses or usage that you're presenting in that table, so if they're gonna be, we're talking about locations wise, correct?
Yes.
So again, on arterial or collector streets, that would be very beneficial to have them on a larger traffic generator roads versus local roads. Especially auto body repair and those type of things. They may fit in a local road, but again, depending on the location, I would strongly recommend for them to be on arterial and collector streets. That's one. Number two is usually on intersections. They would be not really close to the intersection, I should say, because of the turning movement, and generating traffic at the intersection would be non-preferable or unpreferable, if that's the right word. That would be my comment of those.
Sorry, got another question. The chart really makes sense and is really nice, very easy to read. If you took into account a business such as like an auto detailer, or similar to the business we talked about a month ago, located on 13th Street, where it was a customization shop of cars with limited repair stuff, would that fit in the LM1 zoning as well? Something like that?
So I believe that type of use would fall under service station.
Oh, okay.
So that would be like the, Carrie?
I think it would probably fall under auto body repair,
Okay.
but it depends on the definition.
Sure, definitely.
Okay.
So auto body repair is often those things that are, I always think of them as the type of auto body repair that's very loud and can be very noxious to neighboring properties, whereas detailing or customization isn't necessarily that. So I think it could fall under both, and would probably be based on the definition of auto body repair and service station, and customization could fall somewhere in between.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Oh, okay.
So
That would
the
be like
idea behind
a
limiting
limousine service would fall in there too, I would imagine, somewhere in one of these districts.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, are there any other questions or comments about the vehicle related uses locations? All right, so we will jump ahead to accessory buildings. So accessory buildings are things like garages, barns, and other type of secondary buildings that require a building foundation, a building permit, or a building foundation. So we would like to get your direction on the permitted number and size and location of accessory buildings on a lot.
And keep in mind that accessory building has a different definition and a different connotation than an accessory structure. Accessory buildings, at least in my mind, have almost all 4 walls or at least 3 walls, so an enclosed structure. Whereas an accessory structure, you might get into things like pergolas or gazebos or things of that nature, things that are open-sided. The one thing that I really want to get the Plan Commission's thoughts and input on with regard to everything else that Jackie had mentioned is consider the lean-to attachment onto a garage that may be for initially storing wood or even large enough to store a vehicle that ends up getting enclosed over time just because somebody determines that the elements are such that they aren't fully protecting what is under there. We want to make sure that we capture all of those instances, and in that case, I would really strongly recommend that we include those in accessory buildings, even though it may be an open-sided structure initially. But that's something I'd like to get the feedback from the Plan Commission on.
I do have a question about that, Carrie. I know in my district we've dealt with, and this was, I don't even know what you consider it, was an accessory building, but it was at, it was actually a covered garage with corners, and it was like for parking campers. The people on Oakwood Road, do you remember that? Where they had to go in and have that all removed. It was basically, it's like one of those
It was a temporary structure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Does that fall into this category here?
We still would have building standards, and Jackie, correct me if I'm wrong, but a temporary structure would not be something that we would consider an accessory structure. So in other words, if they wanted a permanent solution for their storage issue, they wouldn't be proposing a temporary structure.
Okay. All right. Okay, thank you.
All right, so jumping in here to the accessory building standards that we're proposing here in the code. So currently the code limits the number of accessory buildings and structures to 2 per lot. We are proposing that the standards for accessory buildings be separated from the standards for accessory structures. So therefore the revised text allows for 2 accessory buildings and 2 accessory structures. Are there any thoughts or feedback on the allowance for 2 accessory buildings and 2 accessory structures?
I guess I want to speak on this real quick if you guys don't mind. I guess I have some concerns with, just a residential lot putting, 2 accessory structures and then 2 accessory buildings, allowing them to do all of that, especially when we're looking at a half acre when they can put 2 buildings that are 1,000 square feet for a 2,000 square foot home. Or, it just seems like it's very excessive to me. It's a lot. I mean, that's a 25 by 40 square foot structure, 2 of them in the back of a home. I'm sorry, but I don't want to live next to that. I don't mind, maybe limiting it to 1 and trying to limit some of the sizes, or say if you're going to have 1 structure, it has to be this size, but if you're going to have 2, it can be no more than 1,000 square feet. I think just by allowing them just to have 2 structures that can be up to 1,000 square feet each, or buildings, I think we're especially in residential. I think once you start getting into agricultural and things like that, I think you can allow a little bit more because it's just a different type of use. But residential, I think we should consider really visiting this and thinking about it.
Good suggestion, Matt. Tell you the truth.
I think one way of addressing that could be by making that maximum of 1,000 square feet be an aggregate for both accessory buildings. So you could have 2 500 square foot accessory buildings or 1 1,000 square foot accessory building, or any deviation therefrom. So it would create a maximum of 1,000 square feet, and then you could play within that range for your 2 accessory buildings.
Yeah, I'm willing to entertain anything at that point. I just think what's written here is pretty big. It's a lot.
To keep in mind 2 situations. One, I can give a little bit of history. If you turn to page 20 of 32 in Article 4, that talks about the accessory buildings. I can excuse me, I can talk a little bit about the history of how those square footages came to be. But one thing to keep in mind is we have the half acre versus anything above half acre plus the limitations thereof. Is that something where if you have more than an acre, you would be considering more allowed accessory building square footage?
Yeah, I think, Carrie, I think you can. I think, you know, we can deviate between two, but I think allowing, you know, maybe like Jackie was saying, where we do an aggregate of a certain limit, you know, or something along those lines, instead of just allowing these two big buildings. I mean, when I sit down and I drive through the city here, you know, one that really reigns to me is sitting on Oakwood and McGraw. I mean, the guy's got a 4-stall garage back there. It's huge. It's massive. It's as big as his house.
Yeah, the accessory structures were not intended to be that big. They were always intended to be accessory to, and accessory to in my mind also means diminutive to the principal structure, which is the residence. Now, a little bit of history about how the allowed square footages for the accessory structures came to be. A couple years ago, we actually had a code amendment, a text amendment that was put forth at the request of a district alderman. And I don't recall off the top of my head which alderman actually requested it, but they thought that the accessory structure limitations were too restrictive. They wanted to allow larger structures. So we actually do have code that allows larger structures now. And like I said, that wasn't that long ago. So I do believe that alderman is still on the council. So you do have the constituents that are within certain districts that are calling for these larger structures. But I do think that Matt is correct. And I do like the opportunity to kind of say, for certain parcels, it is appropriate to have a limitation of maybe 1,000 square feet cumulative and 2 accessory structures or accessory buildings total. And then if you meet a certain threshold, perhaps you can get a little bit more, you know, the larger you get in terms of property.
I think that's important. I think there's a distinction that needs to be made between just the mere size of a parcel. I mean, you can have a half-acre lot in a subdivision, and I'm sure we've got several of those, but that's a big difference than having, you know, a half-acre in the middle of a subdivision and a half-acre, you know, along, like I said, a collector or arterial street where you're not in that subdivision setting. So I would prefer, and you know, keeping in mind the concerns and the thoughts expressed by the other commissioners, that instead of just putting a blanket, you know, half-acre on it, I think we should bump that up to somehow really exclude the vast majority of those parcels that may be located within subdivisions. And maybe a better parameter for that, it might be something 1 acre or greater, because typically you don't see those in subdivision settings.
Yeah, and you know, it is kind of tricky. And Carrie, I think what you're speaking of, and actually I think I brought it forward, was we had some homeowners that had an older home in the city of Oak Creek, and their single car garage from 1920 something wasn't cutting it, and they needed a better garage, bigger garage, and the lot size and and it just didn't fit. We had to go and redo it for them. Basically, they got it done, and we helped them through it. But there was a case where, you know, just given the times, they needed that bigger 2.5 car garage.
Well, and that, I can appreciate that, but I also think that perhaps the square footage allowances may have caused a little bit of an unexpected result, shall we say. We thought we were okay with the maximum square footage or 75%, whichever's less. I think that some people were trying to be more accommodating of those particular instances where somebody wanted a 3-car or more garage. We do also have people who add on to garages. We have people who are looking to, you know, kind of have more than one accessory structure that's allowed. But it is getting to an issue where we have to look at what is appropriate where, and what the range is that'll be acceptable to the council, the city, residents, those kinds of things. And I agree, it depends on the times. But what we don't necessarily want is somebody building, you know, a large barn in the back of their quarter-acre lot.
Carrie and Doug, how does this impact the residents on 13th Street right over by Daniel Lane? They had been trying to get something done with their garage, and it had to do with the size of the house and the site. Would this impact them? Would they be able to do anything based upon what we're proposing here?
You know, Chris, I'm not, I don't recall the specifics of that case, but I think in all cases, what we're trying to accomplish here is, we don't necessarily want to have accessory buildings which are bigger than the houses in which they're accessory to. And I think that's probably a statement that everyone can hopefully agree on. And in some cases, you've got to set a percentage, whether it's, and I think it's 75% of that, or obviously with certain exceptions, they can have a minimum size of, a 2-car garage or what have you. But I mean, I think the danger that we kind of fall into when we try to be accommodating to individual circumstances is that, and I think Carrie alluded to it earlier, that there are unintended consequences. And I think that it's, what we're searching here for is an acceptable community standard for that. And for those instances where there are situations that occur outside of those community standards, provided that that individual can prove a hardship, there's a variance procedure for that, and there's a process for them to go through that. Now, just saying, well, I want a bigger accessory building because that's what I want, well, that's not going to cut it. But certainly, if there's something unique to the property and it meets the criteria for the granting of the variances, there's an avenue for that. But it shouldn't be that we're trying to craft a citywide standard based on some very narrow parameters applicable to just a certain few lots.
And I know it partly, though, in this case, that there is I know that the inspector on that went and looked at their house said that, regardless of however they applied for this, that they weren't going to get it. So that was part of a whole set of another issue. So I don't know how we go about that and seeing if they're getting really what they're trying to get, or if there's any way that they can do what they want to do or something close to it that would be acceptable to them. So there has to be some other way that they can go on another workaround besides possibly just the one person that they're working with.
So another factor that will control the size of accessory buildings is the permitted location of accessory buildings. I want to show these example graphics to really give you an idea, a visualization of what we're proposing this language be. So we're proposing that we revise the permitted locations for accessory buildings to 3 different places, either completely within the required rear yard and a minimum of 5 feet from the property line. So in these pictures, it's this area here, the blue area. So if it's entirely within this hatched area, then it can be 5 feet from the side and rear lot lines. And then if it's partially, located in the blue area and then a little bit here, then it would have to comply with the side yard setbacks. And then for a corner lot, you would have your corner side yard. So it would still have to be set back from that corner side yard. You would not be allowed to have any type of accessory building located in the corner side yard or the front yard. So that would be similar to if this were the front of the property. Are there any questions about the permitted locations for accessory buildings? All right. So now we're going to go move on to accessory dwelling units. So accessory dwelling units are coming, this recommendation is coming from the comprehensive plan. a recommendation to encourage increased density where appropriate. So one strategy to accomplish that is to permit accessory dwelling units. So these are also called granny flats, garage apartments, coach houses, carriage houses. They have plenty of names, but the majority of the time they are either attached or detached to the primary unit, as just a separate dwelling unit on a property. So the comprehensive plan recommends that ADUs be considered for the RS4 and the RD1 districts, but further analysis showed that ADUs are really more appropriate in the lower density districts where they would have little to no impact on community character because they would be able to be kind of disguised or hidden more within those larger lots. So to ensure that they really don't impact the character of those residential areas, we're recommending this set of use standards. So these standards are really going to ensure that the either the attached accessory dwelling unit, external accessory dwelling unit, or internal accessory dwelling unit doesn't change the appearance of the house from the street. So limiting it to one curb cut, making sure that there's not a front door to your accessory dwelling unit next to the front door of the house, right? So it really from the street just looks like a house, and it would be, you know, you'd have to be in the know to know that that was there. Also addressing parking to make sure that there's no additional on-street congestion because of the additional density. Is there any questions about accessory dwelling units?
I see, you know, I like that it's limited at 800 square feet. Is there a minimum? Would tiny homes be considered an accessory dwelling?
It's my understanding that states are moving away from allowing for a minimum square footage. I can double check if that's true in Wisconsin. But if they're following all of the other regulations, like they would need to be permitted or to receive their, to be permitted, then whether it's a tiny home or not, I think wouldn't impact the residential character any more than a larger one would.
Thank you. I guess one more thing. I think you've answered it. It would have to meet all codes, so it would have to have full working plumbing, correct?
Yep, so it would have to have all of the same things that.
And anything we require in a home.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so next we want to talk about food trucks. So this is going to move into our temporary use discussions. There's a couple temporary uses we wanted to go over, starting with food trucks. So I know the city has had success in the past with food truck related events. So they asked us to draft regulation to allow them on a more regular basis as appropriate, more broadly throughout the community. So food trucks are proposed to be included as a permitted temporary use in Oak Creek in those non-residential districts. And they would come along with or be accompanied by some specific standards, which would really just make sure that the on-site maneuvering, the driving, the walking, et cetera, would be done in a safe manner. It's not going to interfere with required parking, and then, you know, not leaving things out overnight or covering ADA parking stalls or pedestrian paths, et cetera. Any questions or concerns about food trucks?
So I want to just kind of draw your attention to two things. One would be the food trucks that we're talking about that are temporary uses. So those that are for a specific event. We're not talking about allowing food trucks just in general to go park in a random parking stall anywhere for a weekend. This is not going to allow for a random food truck to show up in any commercial district parking lot, for instance. The other part that we want to talk about would be the establishment or the possibility of establishing food truck, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm blanking on it. Basically, a park, yeah. So basically a dedicated location where food trucks would be set up on a regular basis, and while the food trucks themselves may come and go, it's a designated area for them to be in that meets all the requirements for the city. It's a permanent use. There would be permanent places for people to gather to eat and possibly for entertainment. So 2 different kinds of food truck allowances that we're talking about here.
Interesting. As far as the park goes, I guess I've never really given it any thought. I'd have to kind of stew on that one a little bit. I'd prefer permanent brick and mortar. Than putting down a paved parking lot just for them. I'd have to think about that one. For the most part, I don't have really a problem with this. Just the question, and it really doesn't have to do with the use. If somebody owns a food truck, and this goes back to a residential business, and they're parking it in their driveway, in their front yard, how do we deal with that?
There is a section of the code that regulates the parking of commercial vehicles in residential areas. We're actually going to move on to that section next to talk about RV parking.
Sorry.
No. We're going to be focusing on RV parking, but that same set of language regulates commercial vehicles being parked in residential areas.
Thank you, Jackie.
I actually have a question about number 4. What does that mean, obtaining written permission from the private property owner? What are we saying here was private property owner? I thought it's going to be a park or a public area.
So let's say a brewery or a restaurant or some sort of use is having a special event that they've gotten approval from the city. If they wanted to have a food truck located at that special event, the food truck operator would need to get that written permission and have that available to show to any sort of official that their being there is approved by the private property owner.
So don't we want to somehow, because if I read this from the outside, private, it could be on my property because I'm a private property owner. So is it defined somewhere? Where does that means? Like a larger restaurant or for a beer garden, whatever that may be. So maybe this need to be defined somewhere.
It's not allowed in residential districts. Jackie,
That's right.
if you can flip to the previous slide. These are the only districts where it would be allowed for a temporary basis. So none of the residential districts would be allowed to have a food truck unless there was a specific special circumstance as part of a one-day event, perhaps, or if it was part of potentially like a neighborhood block party. But it would be event and temporary specific.
Okay, understood.
They do have a food truck park, if you will, at the community center on Wednesdays, but that's on private property. So that would be that would be allowable based upon this, right?
It would be a permitted temporary use, but if they're doing it more than just what's allowed per the temporary permit, then that would be a permanent use that would have to go through a conditional situation.
Okay.
And right now, we don't allow for that. We only allow for food trucks as part of a special event.
Got it.
Do we have any maximum of number of food trucks per event?
No.
Doesn't have to be based on the size of the lot?
Well,
So
it would have to meet all the criteria on the screen, but if you're talking about having more criteria, we can certainly talk about that.
Yes, I would like to add that or look into that because I think we need to limit the number of trucks allowable per size of the lot. So we don't cramp them or someone want to cramp them and we have some access issues or safety or fire or police, whatever that may be, necessary access. So it should be limited.
The way it's written currently is there is only one food truck allowed per site. So if there was a larger event like the food truck festival that you all held in the town square, then that would be approved differently or separately from this type of temporary use. It would be more for as a part of that special event permitting process.
See, I'm a little bit more details because per site here, site is questionable and you can't argue that. Site means like what, half an acre? Quarter of an acre? What does site define?
That's a very good point. We can clarify that language to make it a lot instead of site. So it's very clear that it is a zoning lot rather than an ambiguous site. That's a very good point.
Correct.
And this is Chelsea. Just a quick question about the two bullets. One, impact no more than 4 parking spaces, and then tables and chairs are permitted. So just to understand, so the food truck can take up at most 4 parking spaces, and in addition to that, have tables and chairs also. Is that correct?
So it's the 4 parking stalls is the overall area that a food truck would be able to operate in. So including parking the food stall itself and where it's going to be located, where the table and chairs would be permitted to be located. And I apologize, these bullet points are a reduced version of the actual proposed language, just to fit them all on one slide and not be too overwhelming. So there is more detail, it's complete sentences in the proposed draft language that does help to clarify that it's overall no more than 4 parking stalls that the food truck would be allowed to operate in.
Okay. And then my other question is in regards to the location of table and chairs, because it says it should not be located in required parking, but if I understood you correctly, that could be located in a parking stall.
So it would be limited to those 4 parking stalls, so no additional required parking or landscape areas or drive aisles. So it really limits their operating area to those 4 parking stalls. And we can clarify that shall not locate in required parking aside from the approved 4 parking stalls to ensure that that's clear. That's a good point.
So are we saying how much area a food truck can occupy with tables, chairs, food trucks, and all those other items that may be involved with the food truck?
Yes, so it would be a maximum of 648 square feet for a typical 9x18 parking stall. So 4 of those would be about 650 square feet.
So should we put those specifics somewhere? Versus
Well, it definitely depends on the use. So if it's located in a parking lot where the developer chose to install or stripe the parking lot to have larger than normal parking stalls, it would be difficult to, or I guess who's going to go in and measure that it's 650 square feet, a little cleaner, a little simpler to identify your 4 parking stalls and just limit your space to that area.
I guess I'm unclear because we're real specific about the houses and the accessories and the dwellings, but we're saying we shouldn't be specific for the food trucks. So I just want to make sure that
so I think the difference here is the difference between a permanent structure, a permanent building, and a temporary use. So the long-term impact of a garage being located in an area where it's not supposed to be is going to be much greater than if a food truck occupies more than 650 square feet, right? Since it's going to be gone the next day or however long the temporary use permit allows them to be there for. So definitely for a temporary type of use, I would recommend having easier to enforce regulations, whereas the permanent accessory buildings, accessory structures, having very specific regulation is important to ensure that there's no long-term impacts there.
And I do hear you. However, if we're being specific, we want to make sure it applies for areas with parking, areas without parking, because what I'm hearing, we have multiple options here. So if these food trucks are in places that a street may be blocked off, how do you identify parking stalls if they don't exist? So
I apologize. I misunderstood that portion of your question. So definitely we can expand this to no more than 4 parking stalls or however many square feet, whichever is less, to ensure that there's really a clear overall standard if it's going to be located in an area that's not a parking lot. That's a very good point. And I apologize, I didn't understand that portion of your question.
No problem. Thank you.
So I just want to jump up here and say that there are some examples for the permanent food truck parks. If anybody's interested, I can send you those examples. There are food truck parks that are in California. There's one in Austin, Texas that I'm actually kind of familiar with. There are a few that are throughout the country, but there's actually one in the Milwaukee area that was approved within the last 2 years as well. So if anybody's interested, I can certainly send you those examples.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that, Carrie. It'd give me a better idea.
Same for me, please.
For me, that's Chassie. Thank you.
All right, so let's move on to our recreational vehicle parking. So this is included in a temporary use that groups together car, truck, and recreational vehicle parking. And these are also accompanied by some standards. So we're really hoping to get your feedback on where recreational vehicles are permitted to park. Currently they are permitted as of right in the ER, RS1, RS2, RS3, RS4, and RD1 districts, so your single family districts, and your duplex district as well. So these additional standards really have not been revised. So we're currently not proposing any large revisions to this text, but staff has expressed that locations where recreational vehicles are allowed to park has been a point of contention in the past and is something that we need to really take a closer look at while we're doing this update process. So we would really like to get your feedback on these existing standards to ensure that they are revised as is appropriate for the city going forward.
I will note that this allows for a recreational vehicle to be parked in the rear or side yard and not closer than 2 feet to that side or rear lot line. We do also have a requirement, though, that's slightly in conflict with this particular section, and this is current code, that says that they must be parked on a paved surface, but that pavement must be 5 feet from the property line. Is 5 feet more acceptable, or is 2 feet more acceptable in terms of where the RV could be parked? We do want to keep it to side and rear, but one of the other considerations here is the number, the size, making sure that it's on a paved surface, the appropriate setback, and whether or not technically in the front yard, you know, and when I say front yard, I'm using that more loosely by saying on the pavement that's in front of a garage, still technically behind the front plane of the house, but on that paved area. Are we going to require RVs to be parked there, or are we going to allow them there? Do we somehow limit it? I think I'm rambling here, but I think those are the kinds of input that I'm looking for the Plan Commission, specific to these types of parking in residential districts.
And maybe to frame it just a little bit more, I mean, this is a issue that we run across a lot, and I think it may not do it justice to try and, you know, just go over the kind of the micro details as they're, you know, in our current zoning code, other than to say that, I mean, it's something that we need to grapple with as a community as to what is and what is not appropriate. And I think that there's some crossover between this, where it's located in the zoning code, and whether or not it should be separated out from the zoning code and perhaps put into a property maintenance code or something of that nature, which is something that the city's considering. So it's, I don't think it's as easy as just, oh, is it 2 feet or is it 3 feet? You know, is it paved or is it unpaved? I think that those are all questions that we have to answer. But I do think that there's a much broader discussion that needs to take place with respect to the parking and storage of RVs, trailers, commercial vehicles, things of that nature. So I would encourage you to certainly if you have questions or comments this evening, let's talk about that. But I wouldn't put it out there that this is the end point for that discussion.
I would agree with you, Doug. I mean, I can name a couple places where there's commercial vehicles, specifically food trucks, parked wide open, right next to the homes, fifth wheels, just on the lawn, the whole thing. So I do think it's a deeper discussion. And again, I don't know if this goes to zoning compliance or where. I think, Doug, you made a good point.
Mr. Mayor, also 13th and Pewts, they got a food truck parked right on they have a driveway that goes along the front of the house, so it's like a half driveway, but then they have a driveway that comes in off of like 14th Avenue, or no, it's actually Violet. So there's a driveway on the side, but then there's one when it goes in front of the house. So which should it be parked in? But then it's also a food truck.
So I agree with what Doug said, but I also I don't want to lose sight of the setback issue, because that is actually part and parcel of another permitting issue that we've encountered quite a bit. And I don't expect anybody to have a particular solution or opinion on that right now, but I do think that's something that we also need to think about with this input about where it's allowed. We did have a situation where there was a little bit of a contention about parking a recreational vehicle too close because they parked on decorative stone. So, and that was closer than 5 feet as required for pavement. These are the types of issues that we're dealing with when applying the code. That is getting into the nitty-gritty, but it is something that I would like to make sure that we all have a clear understanding about once the zoning code is adopted.
I just want to clarify and be sure everyone knows that if you need time to kind of ruminate and think about these things more, this is definitely not your last opportunity to provide comment or provide feedback. The proposed language for the zoning code can be changed, can be in flux until it's adopted. So this really isn't the last opportunity, even if when we move on to next sections of the code, that does not preclude you from providing comment on this section as well. So please feel free, if you feel the need to think about this in more detail or maybe get more information, to please do that.
And it is interesting, Carrie brings us up about, the very first bullet point, to the rear side of a yard, no closer than 2 feet to the lot line. I mean, you're literally parking that right on your neighbor's lot line. And where my house sits, there's 2 sidewalk, there's not much between the homes, and for me to stick something there would really be an irritation for them, or vice versa. This is almost like a deterrent not to do it, correct? I mean, I guess it shouldn't be, but kind of is. I would think 5 feet might be the acceptable number. I don't know.
Like I said, this isn't something that I'm expecting anybody to have a solution or an opinion on immediately. It's something that, as Doug said, we do need to talk about in whole with all these other issues that we are addressing. But it also comes to the point where you have the recreational vehicle parking on a paved surface on the property. What is that relation to your accessory structure allowance? There's a trade-off there that we need to make sure we have a balance.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
This is Chelsea. So I just want to make sure I understand this. So the first bullet point is saying where the vehicle should be located. And it's only saying the rear and the side, but yet the next item is saying you can also do the front yard. So are we saying it should be the rear and the side, and if they don't have a rear and the side, put it in the front? I'm trying to link these 2 bullets together.
So currently, as the text reads, it would only be allowed in the front yard under certain circumstances. So if there is a driveway or a turnaround, it would be permitted in the front yard. Otherwise, if that does not exist, then it would be required in the rear or side yard.
Oh, okay, so the request or the recommendation actually is the front yard first. So should that be the leading line and then say, if not available, then rear or side? Am I understanding that correctly?
I don't believe the front yard would be the preferred location. But if they're, the way that it's written currently, if a driveway or a turnaround is available, then that is, it could be parked in that area. So I don't think it's the preferred location for parking of a recreational vehicle, but it's an option if a driveway or turnaround exists on the property.
The full text of this section is pages 29 and 30 of 32 in Article 4, if you're following along with the printed version.
Page 29?
Yes, that's where it begins.
Got it.
Yeah, it's a very lengthy section. So I did definitely reduce down the language to be more consumable on the slide.
So we do want to encourage, I'm still looking for it. So we do want to encourage that first bullet. However, give them the option for the second bullet. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, got it.
I lived in a subdivision where we had, our own set of rules. And in Oakwood Lake Estates, we were not allowed to have any recreational vehicle as well as the boat trailer, all those kind of things in the front yard whatsoever, except for a short period of time. And I believe it was 5 days that you could have something parked because no one likes that look at, in your front yard. So could that be something too, that there's some stipulation that, people like bring it home to clean it out or to get it ready for a trip or something like that, where there was a limited time you could have it in the front yard, but then for like parking it for long term or through the winter, it'd have to be in the back of the house or on the side of the house.
Dawn, this is Carrie. I think we run into a situation where they potentially don't have any access to the rear if they're parking it in the front. So we're encouraging, the first preferred location is obviously behind the house. So side or rear lot line, setback, side or rear yard. If that alternative doesn't exist and the only possible location is for them to park it, let's say in front of the garage or off to the side, I'm just thinking of a situation where somebody did not have any way to get around their existing garage and home in order to park anything in the rear or side yard. Whether or not that's a one-off or if that's something that's more common, I'm not sure. But it is something to consider.
Right. What would happen in our case is that you had to find a different place to park it. You had to rent a parking area. You couldn't have it in the front of your house.
And that's definitely valid point, because we try to be very accommodating for people to make their individual choices, but as a community, is the standard such that, well, maybe your first choice should be go find a place to rent that so you don't have to store it on your lot, in your driveway, because that does impact the neighborhood, that does impact your neighbors. And it's just one of the areas that as we grow, as we transition as a community, some of the things that we allowed back in the 90s or before that, when we had the earlier zoning code, it's a much different community. And as the community transitions, as the community grows, those standards may change. So that's really kind of the overarching discussion that we'll have when we talk about property maintenance. And I would hope that we have when we talk about the ability for people to, like Dawn said, oh, I don't want to pay to store my boat, so I'm going to park it in my driveway for the winter. Is that appropriate? I guess there's a number of opinions as to whether that is, and that's kind of, before we can talk about what the standards are for that, I think that we have to kind of decide where we stand as a community on that.
Most HOAs have some type of clause like Dawn was alluding to. So and we have the same thing by us.
I'll say that in my experience, working on zoning codes throughout the country, you do see the allowance for recreational vehicle parking in more rural municipalities. And then as communities become larger and become more urbanized, you do see a prohibition of recreational vehicle parking in residential areas completely, or especially in front and side yards.
So that's a good point. Do we say that you're only allowed to park recreational vehicles outside if you're on a larger lot, where it might have less impact to the neighbors, for instance? Just thinking, like, if you have a 1 acre lot, you'd still want to encourage that in the side or the rear or the side yard, though.
Yeah, I think you would.
Yeah.
This is Chelsea again. One additional question in regards to recreational vehicles that I had on my list. I noticed that yard maintenance equipment is considered recreational. So I just wanted to know, is this common?
Sorry, I'm trying to read the list here.
Oh, Chauncey, I think it's not considered a recreational vehicle per se. The section heading is actually car, truck, and recreational vehicle parking. I think what that's actually getting at, Jackie, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's your riding mower situation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so it'd be a riding mower, that type of much larger yard maintenance type of equipment.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so let's move on to our last section here, building materials. So this is new language that we are proposing apply to a variety of uses in Oak Creek, including multifamily development, single family attached, so your row homes or duplexes, clubhouses, neighborhood retail and service uses, and cafes. So these standards were developed based on conversations with staff where they relayed concerns about new building materials that don't really have a proven track record of durability. So these proposed standards are meant to balance that need for durable and tested materials on the ground floor, where they would get the most wear and tear, with the need to keep the cost of building down, so really be friendly to developers by allowing those secondary building materials on upper floors. Are there any questions or concerns about the building material standards that are being proposed?
Yeah, this is Chelsea again. I noticed that the thickness of some of those materials have changed. It was 4 inches and now it's 3 inches. So I just wanted to get your feedback on kind of why the change to 3.
So in our research of building materials that are really time and weather tested, and what's really been proven to have a track record of durability, that 3-inch stone veneer system does a good job of wear and tear. So it doesn't have the same issues of durability that those, I guess, thinner building materials would have. So it's definitely a technology improvement that would allow for that durability with a thinner type of material.
Jackie, would that also apply to brick veneer?
Yes. So we could expand that to just veneer systems or stone/brick veneer systems. We can expand that language for sure.
Okay.
How does staff feel about the 3-inch versus the 4? Because that's always been a sticking point.
My understanding, and it's limited based on the knowledge that I've gotten from the brick industry representative that came and talked to us a couple years ago, it really is more a function of how it's attached to the building, whether or not it's going to be a failure or a success in terms of long-term durability. So the systems that are generally thicker are not adhered to the building. They're kind of what they call tied in. There's a kind of like a skeleton, if you will, that goes over the exterior wall, and then the brick or the stone veneer is actually anchored to that system. Whereas with the thinner materials, where they can get down to even 1/4 of an inch, it's what I lovingly refer to as lick and stick, literally adhered to the wall with just an adhesive material. And it's that adhesive material that can fail because there are different conditions under which, if it's not mixed correctly, if it's not put on properly or evenly, or if it's, you know, the wrong weather conditions during the installation process, that can cause those thinner materials to just pop off the building and fail. Now, granted, that may be something that has become less and less common based on technology and installation improvements, but those were the initial concerns with the less than the standard, which is actually 3 3/8 inch or 5/8 inch thick brick. So I actually had one consultant who was arguing with me that 4 inches wasn't actually a standard, that it was 3 5/8, and I said it's close enough to 4.
I'll give you that. A 2x4 isn't 2x4 either, so
Yeah.
you're correct.
Any more thoughts or concerns on building material standards?
You know, we always come across hardy board and geez, what did we just talk about 2 weeks ago endlessly
Oh,
at the vet clinic?
yeah. It wasn't fiber cement. It was that oh, I just had it. That siding, smart siding, LP smart side.
So I mean, should we take a look at those and include those as acceptable materials as we're going through this?
I mean,
Is that
honestly, Mayor and Commission, I mean, I think those are the discretionary items that we don't want to introduce that as, you know, oh, or you can do this. I think that the language that's in there, and it can be certainly tweaked, but about having the more durable materials on the ground floor, and maybe those are acceptable on upper floors or above ground level in some way, shape, or form. But I think that if we have that in there, automatically people just default to, well, that's the cheapest way of doing it. That's what I'm going to do. And I don't think that's necessarily the standard that we want to set as a community for the durability and sustainability of our buildings. Because if you've seen the samples for that siding, what is what's essentially being passed off as masonry, it's really not. I mean, it might be, there might be masonry product in it, but it does not have the look or durability. I think they said you've got a 30-year warranty. Well, we want more than 30-year buildings in the city of Oak Creek. So, I mean, I think there's room for a lot more discussion. I just don't want to, we need to strike the appropriate balance between affordability and sustainability.
Agreed. I just want to make sure that we're covering the systems because we're pretty antiquated. I mean, fiber cement board or hardy board plank's been around for a long time, yet it doesn't exist in our code.
Yeah, and that's true, but I think that we would all agree that there's a difference between, I mean, if the standard, if we're looking for stone or masonry, pretty big difference between stone and masonry and hardy board siding or hardy plank siding.
I would agree, without a doubt. I mean, Do we let vinyl siding go in residential homes anymore? I mean, just building products improve and change and things of that nature.
Yeah, and I certainly want to be flexible with that, the new technologies, but I don't want that to be, oh, this new thing came out with some cement powder in it, now that's considered masonry. I don't think that's the intent here. I think that the intent is to have a more timeless type of materials, especially as it meets the ground level. So I think from my perspective at least, and certainly the commission deals with it all the time, I mean, you need to decide, you know, what you as a community, how you want a minimum standard for your buildings. And I think this is a good start to that. And I think we can tweak it so that we're open to new technologies, new products, and I don't want to ever exclude something that's kind of, you know, a best management practice or something that's really accepted in the construction trades. But at the same time, I don't want the commission to be in a position that they feel that they have to approve these things because they're quote unquote masonry.
Understood. Okay, thank you.
Now for building materials outside of the building, should we also include the stone or brick that should be used for trash enclosures? Because I know that was a lengthy discussion that we had also.
Definitely. So the screening requirements for things like trash and recycling receptacles, that's going to be part of the next chunk of articles that we deliver to you all. So it's going to be, so actually the next steps are to deliver, unless there's additional questions on building materials, I'll move on to those next steps. So we are currently going over those district standards. So next we'll go over the development standards. That includes the screening requirements, parking requirements, landscape requirements. So that those standards will all be included as a part of development standards. And majority of the communities that we work in, we include in the screening requirements language that would ensure that the materials used for those enclosures are either substantially similar to or identical to those used on the primary building.
Jackie, I think from experience, we want to be a little bit more tight on the enclosure materials. We, within the last couple of years, had an enclosure fire because, yeah, and the materials that were used were matching the building, but they chose a fiber cement product.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some concerns raised by the fire department that we really shouldn't be encouraging materials that are not fire resistant. So I think maybe that is probably some language we need to include in our update, as well as materials for the gate itself.
Definitely. All right, so that is the end of the slides that we have here. Were there any other questions on other sections of the code or any other comments you all want to discuss right now?
You know, just very quickly going back to the original with the zoning and the allowed uses, we had like microbreweries in the B4 district and things, and we had a guy come in years ago asking about distilling spirits, and it's permitted in an M1 use, but they're becoming fashionable to be a tasting room, almost like a microbrewery. Would that be acceptable in a B4 district? I guess it's up to us, but, or is that out of bounds?
So in my experience in other communities, the tasting room is often allowed in areas outside of industrial zones. So in your commercial districts, your town center district, having a tasting room would be a great addition, right? It's similar to a bar, similar to a restaurant, whereas the actual producing or production of the spirits or the wine or the beer in large quantities is more appropriate in those industrial areas.
Okay, I know the city of Milwaukee does it, and it's kind of it's in the 3rd ward. So I mean, it's a commercial district, but there is residential right there as well. So,
We could definitely look into micro distillery standards, micro winery standards, see if those are things that we would want to introduce to Oak Creek. I could definitely work with Carrie on refining those if we want to expand.
yeah, I guess we can gather staff's opinion on that going forward, because those are becoming very marketable trends for those that partake.
I have no concerns with exploring micro distilleries and micro wineries in addition to microbreweries.
I have a question. I'd like to go back to section 3, the first page of building height. We talk about the maximum of 50 feet high. How does that fit into the airport approach that we have? Is there a limit for that height because of the airplane or the airport, I mean, approach coming from the south?
So any airport zone regulations would supersede those of the zoning code. So if there are, those would be located elsewhere in the municipal code and would regulate height in a manner that supersedes the allowance for maximum height through the zoning code.
Okay. What about our fire department too and their ladder truck? How high can they go to help on some of these buildings if they're up to 50 feet?
This is Assistant Chief Mike Havey. Our aerial truck has a reach of 100-foot platform, if that answers your question.
Sure.
All right, well, it doesn't sound like there's any more questions. So I just thank you all so much for being so engaged in this presentation. It's really wonderful to be working with a planning commission that actually takes the time to review the materials and engage in conversation. You won't be surprised, but that doesn't happen with every community we work in. So I appreciate all of you very much.
Well, thank you for your time and effort. This is a lot to go through. As I said to the council earlier in the year, you know, we get to see a lot of fun, exciting stuff, but this is probably the most important thing we're going to be working on throughout the entire year, because we're going to send it on to council, and it's going to set the tone for this city for years to come. So it's worth reviewing.
Definitely. Might not be the most fun material that you review for planning commission, but hopefully it's the most impactful and most long lasting going forward. So.
And keep in mind, this isn't a knock on staff or to Jackie. No matter what we do, we'll miss something that somebody will come up along the way and it won't be right and it won't fit their situation. And as Doug said, it ain't a one size fits all, but we have to go for a minimum standard in the city. So.
And even if we go through the whole process and we think it's probably the best, most inclusive document ever, inevitably, once we apply it, we'll go, we missed something. We can always go back and amend it as needed. If we try something and it's just not working out, there's nothing saying that we can't go back and revisit it. I don't want anybody to think that once we have this, we're locked into it. No, that's not the case. But this is the most comprehensive overhaul of the zoning code that we've had since 1995. So that's why we're paying so much attention to it. That's why this is incredibly important that we get all of your input. And, you know, if there's anything that you think of, you know, following this meeting that you want to talk about, if there's a situation that you want to see how this would apply it to, let me know your concerns. If we're missing something that you think would be good to include, you know, for addressing something positive or negative. If you see something cool in another city that you think we should, you know, try and encourage here, let's talk about it. Let's see if there's a way that we can make it happen and work within the code. But as Jackie said before, and as Doug said before, this is an ongoing conversation until we get to a point where we want to present it to council for adoption. So we're targeting the end of the year. We have a pretty ambitious timeline for at least getting the draft to you to review and to the council, but if we have a lot of questions and comments and discussion that needs to happen once we get that full document together, we're going to do it.
And again, we're very fortunate, Jackie, here. We have we have some members of the commission that are very long-term commissioners, so they've seen a lot. They've experienced a lot in the city, what's come before them. And those that are newer have a really good background into development, planning, construction. So I think we have a really good mix going on here, really good diverse mix, and very experienced too, long-term.
Okay, I think that's all that we had. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yes, very much appreciated. That'll move us to adjournment, correct?
Do you have any announcements?
Dawn, what's going on Saturday? We got to have something going on in the square.
We do. We have the farmers market again. We'll start with the 11th week. So we're going to start the second half. And we have, I believe, 4 new vendors coming into the market. So watch Facebook, our farmers market Facebook page for a list of the new vendors coming in.
Excellent. And remember, we still are under a state mask mandate. So please, whether you agree with it or not, have respect for others and please wear it in public. It is required in our Oak Creek buildings. We want to ensure the safety of all. So if you could comply, we'd appreciate it to help pull us through this as soon as possible. All right. Anybody got anything else? Seeing none, adjournment, please.
Carrillo moves to adjourn at 7:46.
Seifert seconds.
Roll call.
Anna, aye.
Sullivan, aye.
Carrillo, aye.
Kevich, aye.
Guzikowski, aye.
Donnie, aye.
Seifert, aye.
Chandler, aye.
Great. Thank you very much, commissioners. I know it was a little long because you had that short agenda and you thought you were getting off easy, but again, this is pretty important stuff. So thank you for your time and your efforts. Appreciate it.
Thank you all. Good night.
Yep. Thank you, Jackie. Well done.
Thank you.